On a winter night in 39 AD, the city of Rome froze. Not because of the cold, but because of the silence. If you had been walking the streets that night, you would have felt it immediately. An unnatural quiet pressing down on the 7 hills, as if the city itself were holding its breath. The usual sounds of the capital, the drunken laughter spilling from taverns, the clatter of carts, the endless arguments of merchants, were gone. In the noble districts along the Palatine Hill, the silence was even heavier. It seeped behind marble walls and thick tapestries into villas where families sat awake in the dark, listening. Fathers stood motionless in their atriums, eyes fixed on the doorway. Mothers clutched their children so tightly their fingers left marks. No one was waiting for a storm. No one feared a foreign army. They were listening for sandals on stone. Imagine you are 14 years old. You lie awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between your heartbeats. You grew up in the most powerful city on earth. You were taught that to be Roman is to be free, that Rome rules the world. But tonight, you feel like prey. Then you hear it. From the far end of the street comes the metallic rhythm of hobnailed boots. Measured, unhurried, the Praetorian Guard. The sound echoes through the alleyways, growing louder with every step. You whisper prayers to gods you haven't spoken to in years. Let them pass. Let them go to the next house. Not us. Please, not us. The footsteps stop in front of your gate. There is no shouting, no violence, just a slow, confident knock. The knock of men who already own everything they see. Your father opens the door, and cold night air rushes in, thick with the smell of torches. A centurion stands there, armor gleaming beneath a lantern wrapped in red cloth. He doesn't draw his sword. He doesn't need to. He simply hands your father a scroll sealed in purple wax. Your father's hands shake as he breaks the seal. He reads, and something drains out of him. He looks older in an instant, smaller. He turns toward you, standing in the shadows, and forces a smile. The worst smile you've ever seen. A smile that says, "I cannot save you." The scroll is an invitation. But in 39 AD, an invitation from Emperor Caligula is not a request. It is a summons. And for the young women of Rome's nobility, it is a death sentence that arrives wearing perfume. Tonight, you are going to the palace. To a place whispered about in markets but never named aloud. A place where the daughters of senators are no longer citizens, but currency. Welcome to the Garden of Venus. To understand why soldiers are taking you away in your nightgown, you have to understand the man who sent them. You have to understand how a human soul can rot until it becomes something else entirely. Caligula was not born a monster. He was born a miracle. His real name was Gaius, and he was the son of Germanicus. In Rome, that name meant everything. Germanicus was the golden general, the hero who reclaimed Rome's honor, the man destined to save the empire from tyranny. Handsome, brave, beloved, and his little son was the mascot of the legions. Picture a 2-year-old boy toddling through a military camp on the Rhine frontier. Hardened legionaries, men who killed for a living, would stop and cheer at the sight of him. They made him a tiny soldier's uniform, complete with miniature sandals. The Latin word for a soldier's boot is caliga, so they called him Caligula, little boot. It was adorable, innocent, or so it seemed. Look closer. This child didn't grow up with toys. He grew up with weapons. He didn't fall asleep to lullabies, but to the sounds of blacksmiths sharpening swords and men screaming in medical tents. He learned to walk on ground soaked in blood. He watched his father command legions with a single word. The first lesson Caligula learned was not love, it was power. He learned that if you are strong enough, thousands will die for you, and if you are weak, you are nothing. That lesson was carved into him at age 7. Germanicus died in Syria, not gloriously in battle, but slowly, painfully, suspiciously. His skin blackened. He foamed at the mouth. He became convinced he was being poisoned on the orders of Emperor Tiberius. When Germanicus died, Caligula's world collapsed. The protection of the legions vanished. He was just a child in a city ruled by the men who murdered his father. What followed was systematic destruction. His mother, Agrippina, refused to be silent. So Tiberius had her beaten until she lost an eye. Then he exiled her to the barren island of Pandateria. When she tried to starve herself in protest, soldiers forced her mouth open and poured food down her throat. The emperor wasn't ready to let her die yet. Eventually, she succeeded, alone, in the dark. Caligula's brothers followed. One was declared an enemy of the state and hunted until he took his own life. The other was imprisoned beneath the palace, reduced to eating the stuffing from his mattress before he starved to death. And Caligula, the youngest, was spared, because he learned how to survive. He became invisible. He learned that emotion was a liability. Grief was treason. Anger was a death sentence. So he killed the parts of himself that could feel. He buried his humanity behind walls no one could breach. The final test came on the island of Capri. As a teenager, Caligula was summoned to live with Emperor Tiberius, the man who destroyed his family. Capri was beautiful. Blue water, sheer cliffs, lemon groves. But under Tiberius, it was a house of horrors. The old emperor had retreated there to indulge his darkest fantasies, far from Rome's eyes, and Caligula was forced to live with him. Every morning, he woke up and smiled at his mother's killer. He laughed at Tiberius's jokes. He watched people tortured for amusement and pretended not to care. Historians say he never cracked, not once. He was obedient, submissive, perfect. So perfect that one Roman orator later said there was never a better servant and never a worse master. Even Tiberius knew what he was creating. He would look into the boy's dead, empty eyes and whisper to his astrologers that he was raising a viper for Rome. All that swallowed rage wasn't disappearing. It was fermenting. For 6 years, Caligula lived in that golden cage. He learned that people are disposable, that morality is a story the weak tell themselves, and that the only safety lies in holding the whip. When Tiberius died in 37 AD, the pressure cooker exploded. Caligula became emperor at 24. Rome erupted in joy. They didn't see the broken survivor from Capri. They saw Germanicus's son, Little Boot. The promise of a golden age returned, and for 7 months, it seemed real. He burned treason records, recalled exiles, paid for games and feasts. He was charming, generous, radiant. Rome adored him. But it was just another role. In October of 37 AD, Caligula fell violently ill. For weeks, he hovered between life and death. Rome slept outside the palace, praying for him to survive. The man who rose from that bed was not the man who entered it. Something had snapped, or finally been unleashed. The mask was gone, and the monster stepped onto the stage. Caligula woke from the fever and looked around his palace with new eyes. For the first time, he truly understood it. There were no rules. If he wanted a senator dead, the senator would die. If he wanted the Senate dissolved, it would vanish. If he wanted to declare himself a god, who was going to stop him? He began small. He ordered his teenage cousin to commit suicide for coughing during dinner. Caligula found the sound irritating. He forced his own father-in-law to cut his throat with a razor. But killing was not enough. Death alone did not satisfy him. He needed humiliation. He needed to prove that he stood above every law, every custom, every god Rome had ever known. He spent money like water. He built a bridge of boats across the Bay of Baiae just to ride a horse across it, humiliating a soothsayer who said no man could. He dissolved pearls in vinegar and drank them. Within a year, the treasury, filled over 2 decades by Tiberius, was empty. The empire was bankrupt. Caligula didn't panic. He smiled. He looked at the proud, moralizing senators, the men who whispered behind his back, and saw a solution that would solve his money problems and feed his hatred at the same time. He would not merely tax them, he would break them. And that brings us back to the knock on the door. Caligula announced the opening of a new wing of the palace. Officially, it was a public service, a revenue project for the state. He seized a vast section of the imperial residence and furnished it with obscene luxury: silk curtains from the east, ivory-inlaid couches, gold statues, exotic incense. It looked like a shrine to Venus, goddess of love. But it wasn't a temple. It was a brothel. And the women who would staff it were not slaves from the market. Caligula did not hire common prostitutes. He sent Praetorian guards into the homes of consuls, praetors, and Rome's highest-ranking knights. He demanded their wives. He demanded their daughters. Let's return to the girl. Let's call her Flavia. When Flavia arrived at the palace, she was separated from her father and led into the depths of the Palatine. Corridors smelled of roses and decay. She was taken into a changing room filled with women she recognized: the wife of a general, the daughter of her father's closest friend. They stood in silence, eyes glassy, like animals already resigned to the trap. Servants stripped away their stolas, the modest robes that marked them as respectable Roman women. In their place came transparent silks, makeup used by streetwalkers. Their identities were erased in minutes. Then they were led into the garden. It was a series of open rooms accessible to the public. Public meaning anyone with money. Caligula had sent heralds into the streets, crying out an invitation: "Come satisfy your lusts with the dignity of the Senate." Flavia was forced to stand beneath a sign listing her price. In Roman culture, a woman's modesty was her life. Her honor was the honor of her entire family. To be displayed like this was worse than death. But the true horror was psychological. Caligula was there. He strolled through the brothel like a manager inspecting his property. He joked with customers. He shouted encouragement. He thanked men for contributing to Caesar's revenue. The Emperor of Rome personally played the role of pimp. This was his message to the Senate: "You are nothing. You are meat. You belong to me." Flavia stood shivering in a drafty corridor while strangers examined her, bargained over her, touched her. She scanned the crowd in terror, praying not to recognize a neighbor, a shopkeeper, anyone from her old life. But worse was still to come. Caligula was not satisfied with breaking the women. He needed the men, the fathers and husbands, to participate in their own destruction. So he hosted banquets. He invited the very men whose wives and daughters were enslaved in the next wing of the palace. Attendance was mandatory. Refusal was treason. Picture the scene: a long table piled with exotic food, peacock tongues, dormice dipped in honey, rare wine. At the head reclined Caligula, draped in silk and pearls, watching. Down the table sat Flavia's father. He had to eat. He had to drink. He had to speak. At some point, Caligula would rise, the music would stop, silence would fall. The emperor would leave the dining hall and disappear into the brothel wing. The guests would sit frozen, staring at their plates. They could hear sounds through the walls, or perhaps the silence was worse. 10 minutes. 20. Then Caligula would return. He wouldn't sit quietly. He would loudly critique the woman he'd just used. Her body, her reluctance, her enthusiasm. He would look directly at her husband and give a review, and the husband had to smile. If he looked down, he would be executed. If he clenched his fist, executed. If he shed a tear, executed. There was a nobleman named Pastor. Caligula had his son executed that morning. That evening, he invited Pastor to dinner. Throughout the meal, Caligula made jokes about the boy's death, laughing and raising toasts. Pastor drank every toast. He laughed at every joke. Why? Because he had another son at home. This was the true genius of Caligula's terror. He didn't just kill people, he made them complicit. He turned the Senate into a room full of men who hated themselves more than they hated him. But terror is fragile. Push a man until he breaks, and sometimes you find something sharp underneath. Caligula made one fatal mistake. He turned his mockery toward the men with swords, specifically toward a Praetorian tribune named Cassius Chaerea. Chaerea was a veteran soldier. He had served under Germanicus. He was disciplined, hardened by frontier campaigns, but he had a high-pitched voice, and Caligula found that hilarious. Every day, when Chaerea asked for the watchword, Caligula gave him obscene answers. He forced him to say words like Venus or Priapus aloud. When Chaerea extended his hand for the emperor to kiss, Caligula would turn his fingers into a lewd gesture and wave it in the soldier's face. It was childish, it was cruel, and it was unforgivable. Day after day, the humiliation gnawed at Chaerea. The guards laughed. The emperor laughed. But Chaerea stopped laughing. He looked at this spoiled, battleless boy, this self-proclaimed god, and decided Rome had endured enough. He didn't whisper to senators. They were too afraid. He whispered to soldiers. "Are we men," he asked, "or slaves?" The conspiracy grew. It wasn't about restoring the republic. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about vengeance. They chose the date. January 24th, 41 AD, the Palatine Games. That morning was hot and suffocating. The theater was packed. Caligula lounged in his seat, laughing, throwing fruit at the crowd. He had just finished a sacrifice where flamingo blood splashed onto his toga, an omen of death he ignored. He felt immortal. Around noon, Caligula decided to leave the theater for a bath and lunch. His uncle Claudius suggested the main road. Caligula refused. He chose a shortcut. He turned toward the Cryptoporticus. The tunnel still exists today. A long, dim corridor beneath the palaces, cool and damp, cutting off the noise of the city. Caligula entered with a few guards, then waved them ahead. He stopped to speak with young noble boys rehearsing a dance. That's when Cassius Chaerea stepped from the shadows. He said nothing. He drew his sword. Caligula looked at Chaerea with confusion flickering across his face. For a heartbeat, he didn't understand what he was seeing. Then he tried to speak. Chaerea struck first. The blade slammed into Caligula's neck, slicing through flesh and bone, shattering the jaw. The emperor collapsed to his knees, hands clawing at his throat, blood pouring between his fingers. He wasn't dead. Not yet. "I am still alive," he screamed. It was the last command he ever gave, a desperate attempt to force reality to obey him one final time, to remind the world that gods do not die. The world did not listen. The other conspirators rushed in. They didn't stab him once. They didn't stab him twice. They hacked at him with years of swallowed rage. 30 wounds tore into his body, chest, face, groin, until the god of Rome lay in a puddle of his own blood and filth on the cold stone floor of the tunnel, crying for help that never came. Caligula died as he had lived, screaming, humiliated, and alone. But Rome does not get happy endings. The German bodyguards heard the screams and charged back into the cryptoporticus. They didn't care about politics. They didn't care about tyranny. They knew only that their master and their pay was gone. They went berserk. They cut down the conspirators. Then they kept killing senators, servants, anyone in their path. The palace became a slaughterhouse, and in the Garden of Venus, the terror reached its final crescendo. Flavia and the other women heard the screams first, then the thunder of boots pounding through the corridors. Locked inside silk-lined rooms, they didn't know if salvation or death was coming. They huddled together, clutching the jewelry forced onto their bodies, listening as the chaos drew closer. The doors burst open. Some women were killed in the confusion. Others were dragged away by soldiers who took advantage of the anarchy. Order collapsed completely. Power dissolved into violence. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, a soldier noticed something strange. Feet sticking out from behind a curtain. He pulled it aside and found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, trembling in terror, certain he was next. Instead, the soldier grinned. "Hail, Emperor!" They didn't want a republic. They wanted a ruler, another paycheck, another master. They carried Claudius to their camp and proclaimed him emperor before the Senate could even react. And Flavia? When the dust finally settled, Claudius restored order. The palace doors were opened. The women were released. But this was not liberation. They walked back into the sunlight of Rome, into streets they had grown up in. And the people did not look at them with pity. They looked away. Fathers turned their backs. Husbands avoided their wives' eyes. In Rome, it didn't matter that you were forced. It didn't matter that the emperor held a sword to your throat. You were damaged, impure, a living reminder of your family's humiliation. The Senate passed no laws. There were no apologies, no justice. Rome did what it always did with its sins. It buried them. Flavia returned to her father's villa and disappeared into its back rooms. She would never marry, never attend festivals, never be seen in public again. She became